Hi guys, welcome to our daily encounter. In Philippians chapter 2 in verse 3, Paul makes a very important statement and it ties to a lot of things that relate to the spiritual life. It says, "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others." Here Paul is encouraging the Christians at Philippi to not be so self-absorbed and to be so self-centered, but to be able to put self aside for the benefit of another person. It says, do nothing from selfishness. Don't be a selfish person. It says, regard one another as more important than yourselves. In other words, hold other people at higher esteem than you would yourself. And then don't just look out for yourself. Look out for the good of other people and seek ways to benefit them as well. And this proper understanding of self and the ability to put self aside for the benefit of another person is one of the central themes of the spiritual life and of Christianity itself. Time and time again throughout scriptures, we are told that we are to put aside self or deny self. Even Christ himself said, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. In Romans chapter 6, we're told that the old self was crucified with Christ. And then in Ephesians chapter 4, we read just recently that we are to put aside the old self, which is being corrupted. But we are to put on the new self that is created by God through Christ Jesus, and to live according to the new self. But this idea of putting self aside is very important for basically two reasons. For one, it'll help us to overcome sin. You know, a lot of sin, if not all sin, it comes out of seeking something for self. That traces all the way back to Genesis chapter 3 when Adam and Eve ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Eve looked at the fruit. She says, it's good for food and it's also good for making one wise. Both things would serve self. The good taste of the food, the desire for the nourishment that would come from the food, but also the desire for wisdom and a wisdom that was forbidden by God. But she took that in a very selfish way. And that really runs through most of, if not all, of the sins that we commit. Usually, when we transgress and go outside the boundaries that God has set for us, is because we're trying to gain something for self and trying to do something that will gratify self, bring pleasure to self, will elevate self. The list goes on. And so by putting self aside and really recognizing the fact that when we, as Romans chapter 6 says, when we died with Christ, when we were buried with him in baptism, we were crucifying the self with him there and putting self aside. And when we understand that, we pull the rug out of sin, because once self is taken out of the way, then the power of sin is very much diminished. So in our attempt to overcome sin, the denial of self is important. But when it comes to love, which is more in line perhaps in what Paul is talking about in Philippians chapter 2, when it comes to loving others, clearly you have to put self aside for that. And any parent who loves their child knows what it means to love a child, and how that oftentimes causes a parent to have to put self aside for the benefit of the child. But that's a little bit easier because that's natural love that we have for our children. It becomes a lot more difficult when it becomes a relationship between another church member, or maybe between a neighbor or a coworker, in which you don't have necessarily a natural love for them just because maybe you don't know them as well. They're not a part of your family. And yet still we're called to not be selfish, not to just look out for ourselves, not to be self-centered, but to be interested in what's going on in other people's lives, and to put them first and to see them as better than ourselves, as to basically quote what Philippians chapter 2 says here. That's a lot more difficult, but it's difficult because we got to lay aside self. And self is very strong in us if left unchecked. And so as we think about the spiritual life and we think about living a life before God, it's very important that we understand that self is not number one anymore. That we oftentimes must put self aside to do as Christ said, deny self, take up our cross and follow him. It'll help us to overcome sin, and it'll also help us to love others as we ought to. Two of the greatest commandments were what? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. To put God first, to put our neighbors first, to love them even as much as we love ourselves, to live a life in which we are reaching out and not always grabbing and pulling in. That's the spiritual life, and that's the life that God has called for. So as we do our reading today, let's think about ourselves and think about how much are we living for ourselves? How much are we interested just in pleasing ourselves and doing what is good for ourselves? And how much time are we spending giving ourselves away to God, giving ourselves away to others so that other people can be benefited and so that God can be glorified? So with that, guys, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.